this. So hopefully it will all go fine.
If you want, I can record. Hold on. If you hold on. I can record from my side as well, but I will need your permission. I just sent a request.
Okay, and do I need to press something?
Yeah, you probably will get a request to authorize me to record it.
Okay. Nothing came through yet. That's on Zoom, right? Or is yeah?
Yeah, it's on Zoom.
No, I cannot see it. Is it because I'm recording? Maybe.
I'm sending again. Oh, if you don't see, no problem. You're recording. I recorded my voice then on this side. At least you get clean voice.
Great.
Yeah, I'm recording.
Okay, so just, I mean, to give you a bit more of a kind of background, I'm preparing a new work for this Biennale in Kaunas, which hopefully will happen. We don't know which format it will take, whether it's online or like kind of as an exhibition. I'm also doing a PhD in arts, and the entire research is more about kind of this idea of death and, well, literally how to die well, or like, if you know this kind of ancient genre of like arts moriandi. So it's like a bit more of a kind of contemporary interpretation of it. And I'm basically interested in these ideas that are, well, probably in your terms, it would be more kind of towards idealism, where like it's all rooted in our understanding of consciousness. So I just thought that maybe we can talk a little bit about your background and a little bit about, you know, your thoughts, and then maybe kind of move towards death a little bit. And your kind of understanding of it as it is. So I was, of course, very curious how, from like science and computer science, from what I understand, and also working in CERN, how did you move towards idealism and metaphysics? What brought you there?
Well, by disposition and by character, I think I was born a philosopher. I've always asked, you know, the big questions: what's going on? What is reality? What is life? Who am I? What am I doing here? But of course, that faded in the background once I went to university. I went to university very early. Had just turned 17. Did computer engineering, which is, you know, it's very down to earth, very pragmatic. You know, things either work or they don't work. You may have beautiful theories. If they don't work, then they are worth nothing. So I was in that mode for several years, you know, 5 years of, you know, basic education of computer engineering. I did a PhD in computer engineering as well. And towards my late 20s, early 30s, I was working on AI as a hobby. I had done AI already, you know, in my professional life. But then my professional life moved on to other things, but I continued to do artificial intelligence as a hobby. And of course, when you're designing something that is supposed to be intelligent, you always ask, could this be conscious too? Because, you know, I am an intelligent being, but the data processing in my head is accompanied by experience. There is something it is like to be me processing data. So what reason would I have to think that an AI would also be conscious, that there would be something it is like to be the AI while it's processing data? So, and it's a vexing question. And the reason it's a vexing question is that it's based on a wrong assumption. But you don't know that. It's a hidden assumption that you're making without knowing. And it puts you against the wall, because whatever you do, however you design that piece of hardware, there is nothing about structure and function that could suggest that there is accompanying experience. So you can change the structure and the function whichever way you want. You have no reason to think that that structure and function would be accompanied by something it is like to be that thing. It's just processing data. You know, it doesn't matter in how many different ways you process data. It's just data processing. It's still a calculator of some form. And at some point, I realized what the wrong starting assumption was. And the starting assumption was that material arrangements are primary and somehow give rise to consciousness, to experience. And you just have to find that specific structure and function that does that. Well, that's completely hopeless. because there is nothing about material configurations, mass, charge, momentum, spin, geometrical relationships, frequency, amplitude, whatever. There is nothing about physical parameters in terms of which you could deduce the qualities of experience, what it is like to have a bellyache, to taste a strawberry, to fall in love. There's nothing about structure and function in terms of which you can deduce qualities. And once I realized that, I realized that, okay, I have to change my starting assumption. Matter doesn't create consciousness. As far as I can know, matter is a content of consciousness. The things I see, touch, the concreteness of this bottle, these are qualities, these are experiences. And I label these categories of experience matter. Matter is the experience that appears on the screen of my perception. But it is in consciousness. So of course I can't create consciousness out of matter, because matter itself is something that appears in consciousness. Once I grokked this, once I realized the hard problem of consciousness, again, that there is nothing about structure and function in terms of which you could deduce experience, then I went a completely different way and started having to develop, initially for myself, a different worldview that would make sense. Because materialism clearly didn't make sense. That was a big realization of my late 20s. Materialism just doesn't add up. We took a wrong turn and we became committed to it, but that path we took will go nowhere. And then began the journey of formulating an alternative that would still honor everything we know to be the case. Like, we know that most of our predictive models in science work. So the universe behaves in that way. If you have a theory of nature that would require the universe to behave in a different way, then that would be wrong. So how can you accommodate everything we know to be the case, know to be true, and consciousness in an internally coherent and empirically adequate metaphysics? And I came to idealism ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And but it interestingly, because before that I did a bit of kind of listening and reading, as I think many people probably also who are reading your books, into like Buddhism and lucid dreaming and kind of these two theories of consciousness, one as a filter and one that it's located in your brain. I mean, what was your research like, or like how did you arrive to this? Was that more kind of introspection, or was it a combination of like looking into philosophies and religions? And how did you formulate that? What was the process like?
I didn't come at it from a spiritual perspective. It was not, and it is still not my character. I came at it initially from a very hard-nosed, logical, reason-driven perspective, and empirically driven. Whatever story I could come up with, it had to make sense of the fact, for instance, that if you drink alcohol, something changes in your consciousness. If a doctor pokes your brain with an electric probe, he can induce experiences in you. So these things would have still to be accommodated by whatever worldview I came up with, because I knew them to be true. So I approached it from, a rational, empirical perspective. But of course, at some point, I'm not blind. You realize that the conclusions you're coming to are, in essence, the same as the conclusions that Indian sages arrived at in the Indus Valley 3,500 years ago, and that many streams of spirituality and mysticism, even Christian mystics, have been talking about for centuries. I was not blind to that. But for me, that only provided a kind of confirmation that I was on the right track.
Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated also by the fact that you use a lot of metaphors in trying to explain those things, because I mean, I can imagine that, I mean, of course they are, I mean, hard problem of consciousness. I mean, if you can come up with something more complicated than that, it's but how I mean, why did you, for example, the metaphor of whirlpool and all the others that you used, how, I don't know, how do you arrive to those? What makes them? Because I'm interested in metaphors in terms of also artistic expression a little bit. So if you could talk a bit about that.
This division of our epistemology between what is literal and what is metaphorically true is fairly recent. For the ancients, everything was a metaphor. You would explain everything by analogy to something else, because there is no absolute root in nature, as far as we can know, in terms of which you could provide a literal explanation. So you only provide similes, comparisons, statements of similarity, which help people understand. It is only since the Enlightenment project in the West, back in the 17th century, that we started talking about, what is the literal truth? What is literally going on? And we came to think of fields and invisible subatomic particles as literally true. Well, they are not. They are handy, useful, theoretical entities. Nature behaves as though there were fundamental subatomic particles and fields. That doesn't mean that fundamental subatomic particles and fields literally exist. What is a quantum field? It's a mathematical tool that allows us to predict the behavior of nature very, very, very precisely. And therein lies its usefulness. We shouldn't throw it away. Fields help us predict nature, predict the behavior of nature, and develop technology. That doesn't mean that fields literally exist. So I'm trying to highlight this, that literal explanations are a recent epistemic invention of the Western mind. Because the conclusion I'm driving to is that everything is ultimately a metaphor. We are monkeys evolved on a peripheral planet of an ordinary galaxy. We did not evolve the cognitive apparatus to go beyond metaphors, similes. We just do not know what the absolute root of what's going on is. It's preposterous to think we could with 1.5 pounds of gray matter in our heads. So I sort of honor that, because I think that's how you reach people best, by providing metaphors that they can grasp, they can relate to their own experiences and understanding. I do make exceptions to this because, I publish in academic journals, and at some point when you're talking to academics, they are not satisfied that you provide just a simile or a platform or a metaphor, because they still have this notion that, oh, you can be more direct, you can be more explicit. So I wrote many papers, which I grouped in a book called The Idea of the World, in which I tried to be as direct and as less metaphorical as possible. But that's the sort of a concession to a prejudice, to a cultural prejudice, to a cultural delusion that we can speak in terms of absolutes. We can't. And if you're speaking in terms of relatives, then you are per force constructing a metaphor. Now, to reach people at large, then I explicitly use metaphors. And you alluded to one, the whirlpool. A key point of my worldview is that at the bottom level of reality, there is only one sort of extended mind, and we are just segments of it. And by postulating it, we avoid all kinds of problems that arise in philosophy if you postulate a multitude of primitives. So if there are multiple minds, how do they interact? That's the interaction problem. Or why would there be multiple completely separate minds popping the universe as primary entities? That's the parsimony problem. So to avoid all that, you postulate one. But then you have to explain why I can't read your thoughts, why I don't know what's going on in Japan right now. Because if we are all in one mind, then I should know your thoughts right now, and I don't. So speaking to academics, then I talk about dissociation, which is a technical psychiatric term, more or less well understood. But when I'm speaking to the average educated person, I talk in terms of whirlpools. You can imagine that one mind as a lake, and our individual minds as whirlpools in that lake, sort of local patterns of localization. And yet there is nothing to a whirlpool but the lake. The whirlpool is just something the lake is doing. You can't lift the whirlpool out of the lake. It's not separate from it. And I would say the same goes for us. Our personal individual minds are something that a universal mind is doing. There is nothing to us but the universal mind, just as there is nothing to the whirlpool but the lake. And yet, we can delineate the whirlpool. We can say, oh, they are the boundaries of the whirlpool. The whirlpool is here and not there. You can do the same with us. You can say, oh, there you are, and here I am. And yet, in my view, we are all just segments of the same mind, just activities of the same underlying mind. And to convey that to people, yeah, I use metaphors. It's difficult to appeal to a regular person by talking about, inferential isolation in dissociative processes. People go like, what? What are you talking about? So I'm fond of metaphors.
But you also destroyed the idea of like a subconscious in a way, because so everything that Freud basically said, right? Because and I personally agree with that, but more also again coming from the kind of religious understanding of mind, probably like the mind as something that is constantly conscious and recording, not necessarily, I mean, always in a state of awareness, probably, but that there is no such thing as unconsciousness. So is unconsciousness then another metaphor that we're using? And to what extent we're dealing with projections in general then?
It's just a word problem. And we get lost in word misunderstandings. Different people use the word consciousness according to different meanings, and they don't even know they are doing that. So to be strict, I would have to say, I think there is only one phenomenal consciousness underlying the whole of nature. And when I say phenomenal, what I mean is it is conscious by virtue of having experiences. And it doesn't need to have higher level mental functions, such as self-awareness, ability to introspect, self-reflection, metacognition. It doesn't need to have any of that. If it is experiencing something, anything, then it is phenomenally conscious. And it is in that sense that I say that at the foundational level of nature, there is only one universal phenomenal consciousness. But many neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, they use the word consciousness when they actually mean consciousness. And the difference is the following. If you are experiencing your breathing, then you are conscious. But you are only meta-conscious of your breathing if, in addition to the experience of breathing, you also know that you are experiencing your breathing. That's meta-consciousness. And of course, you also have meta-consciousness. If you know that you are experiencing your breathing, then you're meta-conscious. So there are many degrees of consciousness according to how many times consciousness folds in upon itself in order to objectify its own experiences. Now, humans are eminently meta-conscious. We say that we have hunger or we have pain. And we make this separation between us and the pain. So like I have pain. So the pain is not me. I am the entity having the pain. We make that separation because we are meta-conscious. We know that we are experiencing pain, but we aren't the pain. We are the entity who knows that he or she is experiencing pain. You see what I mean? So we are fundamentally self-reflective when we do that. And it's only by doing that that we can report on experience. I can only tell somebody else what I am experiencing if, in addition to the experience, I know that I am experiencing it. So for many professionals, consciousness means actually meta-consciousness. So if you understand it that way, then of course there is a subconscious, there is an unconscious. It's just the non-metacognitive part of consciousness. It is still experiential, but you can't introspect into it. You're not able to say, I'm having that experience, in just the same way that most of the time, you're not meta-conscious of your breathing. You're experiencing your breathing all the time, but most of the time, you're not metacognitive of it, meta-conscious of it. You have the experience, but you're not telling yourself, oh, I'm having the experience of my rib cage inflating, air flowing through my nostrils. No. You only become meta-conscious of it when you direct your attention to it. You can have a whole world of experiences that you cannot reach through attention and metacognition. You can have feelings that you don't know you are having, regrets, fears and anxieties that you don't know you're having, and yet they're controlling your behavior. I mean, the therapy office of a depth psychology is full of these so-called unconscious contents, which basically are phenomenally conscious experiences that the subject is not aware that he or she is having. That's all there is to it. But once you bring your attention to them through careful introspection, you're not only realizing that you're having the feeling or you're having the pain, you also realize that you were always having the feeling and you were always having the pain. You just didn't know that you were having the feeling and having the pain. So in conclusion, it's a long answer. There is no unconscious or subconscious in the sense that there is something that is outside phenomenal consciousness. I don't think these things exist at all. But there is a quote subconscious or a quote unconscious, in that there are experiences that we are having but don't know that we are having. So from that perspective, I acknowledge the unconscious and the subconscious.
Mm. It's interesting you also mentioned the language as a kind of, if I understood correctly, partly limiting factor. And I was reading Wittgenstein, but of course with my limited logical thinking, partly very hard to understand also. But I found it fascinating also in relationship to like I love the way he kind of describes that the limitations of our language is essentially the limitations of our understanding also.
That's
So
the
I was
late Wittgenstein, yeah.
yes. So I was wondering, like, what's your kind of how do you relate to that language problem, and what we can actually language as a tool to understand and also explain, and maybe even to transform our, I don't know, world of experience.
Language is language is a tool for communication to others, but it is first and foremost a tool for communicating to ourselves. We think in language. We think in syntactical, grammatical terms. We tell ourselves in language what we are experiencing. And then from that perspective, language is the tool of meta-consciousness, of self-reflection, of self-awareness. And the self is then the subject that is narrating to itself in language what it is experiencing. Like when you tell yourself, oh, I regret having done that so much, and that's why I feel so bad right now. That's the language thought patterns going on in your head. So it's a great tool for metacognition, metaconsciousness, self-reflection. I'm using these terms all interchangeably. But it is also limiting the moment you think or the moment you tell yourself that whatever you're not telling yourself in language doesn't exist about you. And that is where tragedy happens. That's where we become dissociated from ourselves and we neglect ourselves to the point of almost death, or often enough, actual death. Because not everything that is salient, relevant, important, and good or bad about you can be captured in your inner narrative, because our cognitive apparatus just didn't evolve to become a meta-conscious of all of our experiences. That is impossible. You would remember everything that you potentially can remember. It would be completely overwhelming. We'd become dysfunctional. So we can't do that. We cannot shine the light of self-reflection on the entire scope of our inner experience. We would become dysfunctional. But it is equally dysfunctional, perhaps more dysfunctional, when we tell ourselves that whatever the light of metacognition is not illuminating doesn't exist. That's when we sort of amputate the biggest part of ourselves, the so-called unconscious or the subconscious. They become amputated when we tell ourselves that they don't exist. And it's also at that moment that they take control over us. They remote control you and you don't even know because you neglect them. You don't think they exist.
Mm-hmm. And what's your take to this kind of balance between the sensory exploration and maybe introspection to understand the reality versus intellectual? Like, how do you personally balance the two? Because yeah, there is this also school which says that the only reality is our sense reality, right? Like the doors of perception and all that kind of stuff. And then there is of course, the science, the logic, the methods, and
Yeah, to say that the only reality is the reality we can perceive is probably the most dangerous bullshit ever produced by the human intellect. It's a denial of humanity, first and foremost, and immediately afterwards, it's a denial of reality because that it's simply not the case that everything that exists and is important appears on the screen of perception. When I fall in love, I don't see the love on my screen of perception. So there you go. What is probably the most driving part of human experience, and which certainly exists, not only exists, it drives history. It's not on the screen of perception. Now, isn't it extraordinarily stupid to deny that? It's almost a psychic illness to deny that. How much fear do you have about what you really, really are in order to deny yourself to that extent? It's an illness. These people are deserving of pity and require medical attention. I think so. I think that sums up my view on this.
Yes, I was also, I don't know why I'm stuck, like coming back a bit to the metaphors. I remember like seeing actually not the film, but a performance of Solaris. If
The
you know,
original Tarkovsky or the...
so Tarkovsky, yes, but then there was actually, what's the Polish writer's name who wrote the text, because I think it's science fiction book originally, and then it was Lech, I think, someone Lech.
Oh, 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 I know exactly who. Stanislav.
Exactly.
Stanislav. I forgot. But then I know who you mean.
And I mean, I was like, I remember seeing that performance and thinking that this was also like another very maybe strong metaphor to understand of how things are generated and how we are kind of dealing with these projections. And I mean, I don't know to what extent you remember the story, but then in that
I remember.
yes. So I was wondering, like, from your understanding, would you say that that is somehow in line with the, I mean, do you think he was kind of intuitively, or I don't know, intellectually alluding to consciousness, although, well, of course, he doesn't claim that in any way, but
yeah, I mean, artists have this tendency to touch on the most important things without making it explicit. I absolutely think so. I think, look, most people, especially given our cultural ethos, which sort of denies mind or makes mind secondary, because of this ethos, most people deny the biggest part of themselves. They deny what a psychologist would call your natural self, as opposed to your adaptive self. Jim Hollis talks about it, the Jungian psychologist, probably the most important Jungian alive, Jim Hollis. We think that our natural selves don't exist, and we identify purely with an adaptive self, a sense of identity that's given by the stories, culture, society, and we tell ourselves about what we are supposed to be and what we are not supposed to be. And then that natural self that we deny, as Carl Gustav Jung put it, that natural self that is repressed and denied, it manifests itself in life, and you call it fate. So you could say that we are always projecting. There is a world out there that is objective, that doesn't depend on what we wish, what we don't wish, what our traumas are, what we repress. It doesn't depend on any of that. There is such a world out there. And in the contours of that world appear on the screen of perception. But that's not the world in which we truly live, is it? The world in which we truly live is the world of what we tell ourselves about what's going on in the world. We live in our own narratives. Otherwise, if you looked out, you wouldn't see streets, cars, and people. You would see pixels, an arbitrary dance of pixels and notes. You wouldn't hear words. You wouldn't see stories unfolding. There would be no meaning. The meaning, which is what which is the world where we think we are living, that meaning is given by us. Um, in a semantic sense, even by us as subjects, not necessarily by us as individuals. Um, so in a sense, most of the world is projected. And I say this not to deny that there is an objective reality, but only to highlight that the reality in which we actually live experientially is a reality of narratives. And those narratives are projected by us. And the more you repress and ignore about yourself, the more those projections will look autonomous and totally independent of you. And they will look overwhelming. And you will feel that you have no power against them. You will feel that you are living in a world where you're completely powerless, and you feel completely overwhelmed. But the more you know about yourself metacognitively, the more you can introspect and spot your own bullshit, all the bullshit you tell yourself, the more you see through those layers, and it's like an onion, never ends. But the more you see through that, the more you go like, oh, okay, I am projecting this whole thing. But again, this doesn't mean that we have the magical power to manifest the perfect lover or to manifest $1 million. I don't think that holds any water. I think it's another bullshit narrative, this time not from scientists, but this time from New Agers. I'm not peddling that kind of thing. Just highlighting that we live in the world of our own narratives, and that is a projected world. Yeah.
Mhm. And now, I mean, moving towards this idea of death. So, what would you say is your understanding? What happens when we actually die? What happens to our mind, or well, our mind too, the
To
long
us,
life mind, yes, to us.
I think what we call life, biology, metabolizing organisms, I think that is just the appearance, the image of a dissociative process in a form of extended phenomenal consciousness that underlies all nature. So when that extended consciousness dissociates a segment of itself, that dissociative process looks like something. Stuff that happens in nature have an image. They look like something when you observe them. And it so happens that what dissociative processes in that mind at large look like when you look at them is a living organism. It's biology. So in my view, life is just that. It's what dissociation in universal consciousness looks like when observed from a certain perspective, a certain point of view. So what is death? The end of life? Well, it's the end of the dissociation. It's a sort of great remembrance of what was going on before you were born, what you thought and felt and knew by acquaintance, not conceptually, before you were born. It's a sort of reintegration with a broader framework of subjectivity. I think that's what happens.
Mhm. And what do you think? Because I will share a little bit also what I've been maybe kind of looking into and what I've been interested in. Because I don't know if there is, for example, there are quite a few of them, neuropsychiatrists who work with like near-death experience, and they kind of venture a little bit into these phenomena, for example, surrounding the deathbed. The fact that a lot of people report seeing visions, which in fact are kind of not hallucinations because they don't have the qualities of hallucinations, but at the same time they're kind of categorized as such. But then there is this denial kind of from the point of view of medicine that this is possible because we have no means to explain that. So I wonder, within the kind of scope of like idealism, would there be a way to explain those things?
Let me start by saying that I think it's tremendously foolish to reject an empirical fact on the basis that your theory doesn't accommodate that fact. That's trying to replace reality with a theory as opposed to trying to make your theory match reality. I am not a student of the phenomena you described. Of course, I've heard of them. So I'm not in a position to tell you whether those should really be taken very seriously because I just haven't looked into it. But they sound completely reasonable to me. I think if the process of death is the process of ending a dissociative configuration of mentation, then the way that would feel from a first person perspective is a sort of a, yeah, as I mentioned before, a great remembrance that, oh yeah, that's what's going on. I remember now. And the phenomena you alluded to have the scent of this thing that I just related. So to me, they're reasonable. I would go as far as to say that if life is a dissociative process, then if that dissociation is weakened, even if you're not dying, but the dissociation is just weakened, for instance, by physical exertion, or chemical substance, poisons, or psychedelics. Psychedelics reduce brain activity. They don't increase brain activity anywhere. All psychedelics we know, and which have been studied, have this behavior. Um, all these things, I think, will tend to make the dissociative boundary more permeable, more porous. So you pick up on things that are on the other side of the dissociative boundary, things that have a non-local, non-spatial, non-temporal character. I think space-time is a category of cognition. It's something evolution has given us in order to make sense of the world. I don't think space-time exists absolutely out there. And if the dissociation is then weakened and the boundary becomes more porous, I think it's reasonable to imagine that people can pick up on things that you would say, well, according to the rules of space-time, that shouldn't happen. Yeah, exactly. Now you are not obeying the rules of space-time anymore, because the dissociative process itself is now compromised, either permanently in the case of approaching death, or temporarily in the case of a psychedelic trip, or hyperventilation, or partial strangulation, or meditation, and there are many techniques.
It's interesting because, again, I mean, I guess as artists, we always float a little bit superficially on all scientific knowledge and trying to kind of connect all the dots. But I was recently also trying to understand a little bit more about black holes. And I'll tell you why, because I spent a bit of time like working with people who were dying in hospices, and one of the projects we did was kind of collecting the stories from them. So like if they were to make a film, what would the film be about? And there are a lot of metaphors about kind of nature and sea, water, I don't know, coral reefs, of course, like dealing with fear and anxiety, exaltation in a way. But so one man told a story how he was kind of being consumed by the black hole, and that led me to look into black holes. And what was fascinating for me is that two things that are contradictory can exist at the same time. In a way that, you know, like from the point of view of someone, you might not exist, but for yourself, you might exist. So I wonder if that somehow can also be linked to the whole idea of how we might not be able to understand maybe the phenomena of death, or like the phenomena of mind as well. But
What we call logic, which is the basis of reason, what we call logic is basically a list of axioms, things that we take for granted, but which we cannot not even begin to prove. And for instance, Aristotelian logic, which is, you know, the colloquial logic we all use, has four or five axioms that are just, we just believe them. You cannot use logic to prove the validity of logic, because if you try to do that, that's circular reasoning. So logic is fundamentally based on axiomatic belief. It's just that the belief is so strong, it's so inbuilt in us, that suggesting that it may not be right sort of violates every kind of rule in our minds. For instance, one of the Aristotelian axioms of logic is that is what we call the law of excluded middle. And it says the following: any statement you make about the world is either true or false. It can never be both, and it can never be neither. Now, of course, right? That's our reaction. Of course, it's obvious. Who would deny that? Well, there is a whole other form of logic called, for instance, intuitionistic logic that precisely denies this. And it is internally coherent. There are very good arguments for intuitionistic logic. So what I'm trying to highlight to you is that the things we take for granted in a normal, ordinary state of consciousness, which we call healthy life, and by that, what I mean is, the fundamentals of our logic, of our reasoning. These are not absolutes. These reflect our peculiar way of relating to ourselves and to reality, our modes of cognition as living human beings, or, which is the same thing, as dissociated processes of a broader mind. What is on the other side of that dissociation need not comply with space-time, need not comply with physics, and, which is the most difficult one for people to grasp, need not comply with the principles of Aristotelian logic. You can be in a mode of experiencing in which you realize that there are whole universes that do not comply with any of these three things I mentioned. They don't obey the linear laws of space and time. They don't comply with the laws of physics, and they don't obey the rules of logic either. I think it is naive to think that reality can be completely corralled and captured by the axioms of our primate logic. That's not how things work. And I think artists are the explorers that we send out across that boundary, across the dissociative boundary, to have a look at what is on the other side and bring something back to us. And of course, they can't use words to describe what they see, because language already has logic and space and time built into it. Subject and object, past and future is all built into language. And it's naive to think that the only things that exist are those that can be spoken. Language didn't evolve to capture the whole of reality. It evolved for very pragmatic reasons. Where is the tiger hiding? Where is the tree with good fruit? That's what language evolved for. So there is a whole realm of existence. It's very reasonable to assume beyond language. And so how can you hint at that? Well, through art. That's what I think artists are deputized by humanity to do. Go across the boundary, have a look, and then bring something back to us in a language that is not language, that is not linguistic, that doesn't have to comply with these artificial limitations of logic and linear space-time and so on.
It's nice to hear that, in the sense that there is still a big debate around what is artistic research and how can it be in general labeled as such, as research. What is there that artists are doing in this hierarchy of science? So I think it's interesting that and it felt also like in your book, Why Materialism is Bologna, that you're kind of giving a bit of space to that kind of other type of knowledge, and which maybe comes not from the necessarily like scientific communities. So what do you think could be the, you kind of mentioned already this bringing something from the other side, but what is there that can what creativity or art can fill? What are the gaps?
Whoa, the gaps, it's like prison break. It's like a window on the wall of a prison. If you don't have that window, it's very claustrophobic inside. The thing is, our culture is driven by very subtle hidden forms of fear, particularly on the other side of the world in America, but here too in Europe. And that fear is a fear of parts of ourselves, parts of what we truly are, our subjectivity, not our personal identity, that itself is a narrative, but our true subjectivity. There are parts of it, huge swaths of it, that we reject and deny because we are afraid of it. We are afraid of what we actually are. It's very scary to become truly meta-conscious of what we really are, because it encompasses the good and encompasses the bad. You realize that the humanity in you is the same humanity in Hitler. And it is the same humanity in Gandhi. Um, and I call it the vertigo of eternity. It's dizzying and it's very scary. So what do? We try to manage our anxiety by not only rejecting those parts of us, but by putting together an entire cultural system, an entire civilization and belief system that not only rejects those, but which tell you they don't exist. They cannot exist, which is even worse. And the story goes like this. Well, you are just a structure of matter and mind. Whatever we can't see when we put you in a brain scanner is not you. And when you're dead, you're dead. There is nothing to fear because there is no wonder after you're dead. That's a very reassuring story. Um, and I think the role of artists is, to put a window on that wall, which is a very scary window, because then you realize, what you're carrying in you, and that can be very overwhelming. But it's the only way to avoid nihilism, the claustrophobia of meaninglessness, which is the price we pay to manage our anxieties. So we manage our anxieties, but we think life has no meaning and that our existence has no meaning. I think it's a very big price to pay. I think it's an unacceptable price to pay. And now we don't even have the personal freedom to choose not to pay that price anymore, because we put together a whole civilization that makes it nearly impossible to even recognize the possibility that we might be a lot more than we think we are. And even a moral system that tells you if you think you are more than what you're telling you you are, then you are arrogant. You're not only a fool, you have a God complex. So you see, it is impossible to face this. It's a concerted effort. That it's not a conspiracy. It has emerged naturally out of the shared fears and anxieties of humans. But artists, which in that sense should be feared, artists, I think, have the moral responsibility to put a dent on this, because there is no other game in town. And I think nihilism is not the way to go.
Mhm. Yeah, that reminds me also of like a terror management theory. I don't know if like you kind of were thinking of it somewhere at the back of your mind, but
Of course, fluid compensation, and that's what's happening.
yeah, yeah, and I mean also this kind of idea of like having a certain type of attitude towards death as something to be feared. And I mean, the more I was kind of looking into it, the more I also realized that, of course, like the entire kind of countries are run on fear, you know, like on this kind of fear of death, basically. And at the moment I'm in Naples, where it's a strange place which seems to completely embrace the existence of death, of course with the same kind of anxiety and everything, but you know, you have like pictures of dead people everywhere, no one is scared to talk about it, and it's just somehow in general closer, I don't know why. But but I don't know, like after thinking about those things, what do you think should be our attitude towards mortality in general? I mean, and how, I mean, and that's also a question, how should we live our lives, I suppose, because it's,
I think under the materialist ethos of our culture, what we refer to as fear of death is actually not that. It's something else. Now, I'm making a big statement here. Let me try to make sense of it. Historically speaking, if you go back way before materialism, way before the Enlightenment project, way before the pre-Socratic Greeks, even, um, the greatest fear of humankind has always been what you will experience after you're dead. And that fear has been the single greatest force in the behavior of humanity. We would do anything or we did anything to alleviate that fear. And it has taken many forms, this fear. In the Christian era, so for the last 2,000 years, this fear has taken the form of the following question: am I going to go to hell, or am I going to go to heaven? So what is the fear of hell? It's the fear that you will experience eternal fire, that you will be burning and in pain. In other words, having an experience. after you're dead. And the church has leveraged this fear to control the Western world for centuries, selling indulgences, guaranteeing that you have a chair or a place in the ship of heaven, and therefore that you're not going to go to hell. And rich people would give enormous sums of money to buy an indulgence. Why? Because their behavior is entirely driven by this, the greatest historical fear in human history. Now, what did materialism do when it arose in the 16th century, and mainly when it became the, the position, the mainstream position in the late 19th century? It told you there will be no experience after you're dead. There will be nobody there to feel the pain of fires. It's just, you turn the off button. It's over. You're off. There's nothing to fear, literally, because there's no one there to fear. So in one stroke, the greatest fear of mankind, of humankind, is off the table. Now, that's the greatest action of terror management in the history of the planet. Now, people don't grasp this, how reassuring this move has been. We focus only on the nihilistic price we paid for it, which is life is meaningless. Therefore, we live in depression and anxiety, because before you die, you're going to suffer. You have cancer or something that will give you a lot of pain. But the actual fear, the historical fear, is off. So do people who are immersed in the materialist ethos today, do they really fear death? I don't think that's what they fear. What they fear, what they think they fear, is annihilation, is non-existence. But is then that really a fear? Because how can you fear not being there to experience anything? I submit to you that this is actually not fear. What's happening here is that when people really grok the idea that they may not exist, that triggers a sort of knee-jerk reaction in mind that tells them, impossible, it cannot be. And the reason is, your subjectivity is the only carrier of reality that you have ever known. The whole universe that you know exists in your subjectivity. So if your subjectivity is not there, then there is no universe. And there's nothing, there is nowhere for you to disappear into. And that leads to a sort of a cognitive dissonance in the minds of people, that makes people go like, no, this can't be. And they think it's fear. No, it's not fear. It's cognitive dissonance. And there is something to be learned from here. There is a part of your mind that you don't admit to exist, that the social cultural narrative has told you cannot exist. That part of your mind is in there, and it's telling you, you're not going to die. Your subjectivity cannot go anywhere. Where is it to go? All wheres exist within it. So where can it go? It is that within which the wheres exist. The wheres and the whens exist. So that's what I think is actually going on. It's a very natural, very foundational, and very strong cognitive dissonance that people misinterpret as fear. I think your personal self, your narrative of individual identity, that's gone. That's associated to your body. We know your body is not going to be there. That's gone. But I don't think you need to fear that any more than you fear the death of your dream avatar when you wake up. When you wake up, the dissociative state that we call dreaming, in which parts of your mind is constructing the environment of the dream, but you think you are in that environment as opposed to be creating that environment, that dissociation ends. And your dream avatar dies. That little character in the dream that you thought you were during the dream, when you wake up, it's gone. It's history, poof, gone. But you don't mourn the death of your dream avatar. When you wake up, you just go, oh yeah, that's what's going on. No problem. Now you put your clothes on, you brush your teeth, and you go on as if nothing important had happened. So I think our personal selves will die, just as the dream avatar dies. It's something mind was doing, and suddenly it's no longer doing. So it's gone. It's a process that it's gone. But it's not an entity. that is gone. We just mistake the process for an entity, and we think we are it. And that leads to all this cognitive dissonance that we speak of as the fear of death. I don't think in a materialist society there is actual fear of death. There is just a very foundational cognitive dissonance that is telling us something important that we should pay attention to.
Hmm. Interesting. So would you say curiosity is the best attitude towards mortality? I mean, to let's see what happens. and just...
That's a good attitude. I think the most important of all is to live well. I think if we live well, we die well. If we live according to the feelings and intuitions of our natural self, when we are in our dying bed, we will look back and think, I've done okay. I think that's the most important part. I think true fear of death, not this cognitive dissonance of the end and annihilation. That's not what I mean. I mean true fear of death in the sense, what will I experience after I die? I think there is a place for that. I have it. I have that fear because it's an unknown experience, or at least an experience you don't remember at the very least. So you don't quite know, or you think you don't quite know what's going to happen. Is it natural to fear the unknown? Absolutely. It's absolutely natural. So from that perspective, I think some fear of death is appropriate in the sense of being natural. I think it's naive and cavalierly to say, oh, I know what's going to happen, so I have no fear of death. Do you really? I have. No. Precisely because I don't think I am going to be gone. I think my subjectivity, not Bernardo Kastrup is a dream avatar, but my subjectivity will be there and it will experience something. And I don't know, I don't remember what that's going to be. So some fear is appropriate. Yeah, sorry, it's not very positive, but what you get in exchange for that true fear is meaning. Because now life is meaningful. Whatever you do, it is the experiencing of things that enriches the universe, that enriches the underlying level of mind that is the foundation of nature. It is the accumulation of experiences, of insights, even if those are very painful insights, for instance, insights about what makes you suffer and why it makes you suffer. The meaning of life, of existing, are those insights. So yeah, fearing death is appropriate, but you don't have to put up with the nonsense of nihilism anymore. You don't have to put up with the nonsense of meaninglessness anymore. You can rest assured that whatever life you've had, it has had meaning and has enriched nature. You are the spy of God, so to say. You are deputized by God to look at God from a perspective not available to God itself.
Interesting, because I was reading also some papers and books by Monica Renz, and she worked with dying people also in hospices for maybe, I don't know, 20 years, but also comes from kind of religious background, but also from therapeutic background. So it's an interesting combination of perspectives, I think. And so she divides death in 3 stages: pre-transition, transition, and post-transition, and kind of describes what happens in each stage. And I think in pre-transition, of course, we're dealing with primordial fear, sort of moving forward. Transition is kind of crossing the boundary and moving back and forth. And the last stage, the way I imagine it, or understand it, is very much about probably this integration of senses beyond language, and has to do like with maybe perception of certain colors. And but why I'm saying this, because I think, again, like in the very abstract kind of way, how these things link back to things like Wittgenstein wrote a book about colors before he died. Aristotle wrote a book about colors before he died. Derek Jarman made the film Blue and wrote a book about colors before he died. And I was also wondering, maybe it's just a pure coincidence, of course, but there is something about maybe this disintegration of senses, which probably also the dissolution of egoic self, I suppose, but also in a perception sense. So just to say that this is quite interesting, but also wanted to link it to your studies of like myths and also Jung. So I wonder how what made you interested in those, and I mean how, you know, because there is a lot of those, of course, like when we deal with I guess primordial fears or like a lot of dying people, for example, they see apocalyptic scenarios or God, or they are disappointed with God, so we're obviously trapped in those kind of stories and narratives and mythology in a way. But I don't know if that was kind of in any way relevant to you, but like what brought you into studying those? And
Well, I've come across Jung very early in my life. I think I was 14. And I sort of happened upon Jung by chance. I read his preface to the I Ching, a book I knew nothing about. I just found it curious. What a funny name for a book. And I started, browsing it. And I read a couple of pages of Jung's foreword, and it made me interested in Jung. And I went on to read the collected works more than once, actually more than twice. So Jungian thought has been with me almost for as long as I can remember. So it was not a deliberate choice to, now I'm going to study Jung because I think Jungian theory fits here or there in the drawers of my epistemology. It was not deliberate like this. It was to use a Jungian concept, it was a synchronicity. I happened upon Jung, and that has proven to have tremendous value in my intellectual development and emotional development too.
Mhm. And what about the mythology? I mean, why do we need myths, or how can they maybe even help us navigate life? I mean, probably.
Because what is most important, the existence of which our culture denies, but what is most important cannot be spoken or worded or written. You cannot neatly capture it in a little story with internal logical coherence. What is most important, the foundation of what we are, escapes logic, escapes language. It's the domain of the ineffable. And the only way for you to touch that, well, there are two ways for you to touch that. One is direct acquaintance. You just find yourself there. And usually the reaction is, oh my God. No, that's how people normally react to that. The other way, if you want to help other people, is to hint at it through mythology. Myths are symbols, metaphors, if you will, that they like the the Zen Buddhists say, myths are the pointing finger. What do you do when you see a pointing finger? You don't keep looking at the finger. You look at where the finger is pointing. And that's what myths are. If you interpret them literally, it's like obsessing about the finger. You're missing the whole point. The finger is pointing somewhere. Look there. It's there. People who interpret it literally don't look there. They keep studying the finger. And they go to extraordinary lengths to convince the entire world that the finger is bullshit, that there's nothing to it. It's just a finger. Yeah, guess what? Indeed, it's just a finger. It's just a myth. But look at where the finger's pointing. Look at where the myth is pointing. And don't try to do that using your reasoning, because the point is to use another psychic faculty that we are all born with. And it's called intuition. Or empathy, and I mean empathy in the technical sense, when you resonate with something else. So you come to know it by acquaintance as well, by replicating in yourself what is outside yourself. So I think myths as symbols, as sort of attempts by people who have been there to point you in the right way, I think they're essential if we are to sort of make contact with the foundations of ourselves, which are the same as the foundations of reality again, and escape this nihilistic madness that has been consuming the West and now the whole world, because the whole world is now Western, for at least a century and a half, if not two.
Mm. Mm. Is there anything else that you think is important to mention or to point out that maybe I didn't think about or I didn't ask when it comes to life and death and mythology and everything that we spoke about?
You're very interested in what it will be like when we die, right?
Yes.
I, there is one very powerful, safe, and effective um, death simulation available to us. It's the best model of death we have today. And it is not meditation. It is not 30 years of prayer in a Himalayan cave. Uh, if you have 15 minutes of time, you can have it. And that is the psychedelic experience. And I don't say that because it's far out or mind-boggling. No, I say that because what it does to your brain is exactly what's going to happen in the earlier stages of the dying process. Psychedelics massively reduce brain activity. They don't light up your brain like a Christmas tree, which was what we thought until 2012. For the past 9 years, we have known, and now these experiments have been repeated countless times. And so now it's secure knowledge. Psychedelics massively reduce brain activity, particularly in a brain process that we call the default mode network. It's the part of your brain that is engaged when you're not active with a certain with a task. So you're not writing, you're not doing your work, you're not gardening, you're not talking to your spouse. You're just lying down at night in bed, waiting to sleep. If they would measure your brain activity at that point, it's the default mode network that is lit up. And the default mode network is tightly linked to the Freudian and Jungian ego. It's the part of our brain activity that engages in the narrative of the personal self. I am this person, I was born that day, I have this profession, I have this many kids, I'm married to that person. All this narrative of self, it's correlated with the brain activity that we measure in the default mode network. And that's exactly what psychedelics devastate. They annihilate brain activity in the default mode network. So it's a fantastic physiological model of death. Now, subjectively, it's a very hard experience because you just ask any psychonaut with enough experience, high enough doses, having done it frequently enough, and they will tell you that the experience, and it's called ego dissolution in that community. That's what they call it, ego dissolution. When you're undergoing that for the first time, you are absolutely sure you are dying. And you will be dead, and there is no return from that, because that's how it feels when the narrative of the personal self is taken apart. You experience that as the death of the individual self, your personal self, which is exactly what's happening. But you are not the personal self. You are that thing that is experiencing the death of the personal self. You are the mind that wakes up from the dream when you wake up in the morning. But you're so convinced that you are the narrative of the default mode network that you think, I'm really dying here. I will be dead and I cannot survive this. Logic is out of the window. You cannot hold on to a coherent narrative about what's going on, and that creates a lot of anxiety in a lot of people. It created anxiety in me several times. But with enough experience, the fear ceases. You just close your eyes and okay, let it go. I know the process, being there. I know I'm not going to be annihilated. I would just think that I'm being annihilated. And then you relax into that stream. You don't try to hold on to logic, to narratives, to consistency. You have to let go of all that. Your experiences become spontaneous. It's like you are walking through a forest. You're not creating the trees. You're just watching them go by. And the experience of ego dissolution is watching your personal self go by and then watch what comes afterwards come by. And you're just watching and you're not trying to control it. The control is gone. You can settle into that and it can become even pleasant. I have done this for 2 or 3 years as part of my studies, because I thought I can't write a book on consciousness without having done this. It would be scholarly irresponsible, especially because I live in a country where these things are legal. So I could do that with my doctor's assistance, of all things. That's why I did that. And towards the end, what I feared the most was coming back, was having the ego narrative reassert itself, coming back into space, time, personal self. Oh, that I call it the re-entry, and that has become very difficult for me. For most people who are doing it for the first time, ego dissolution is devastating. It's devastating. It's like the worst experience you have ever had in your life. And re-entry is very reassuring. It's like you're recomposing your personal self and you go, oh yeah, I am this person. I live in this place and it's the year 2021. And oh yeah, then you feel reassured. With enough experience, that becomes devastating. The re-entry, it's like you are going back to prison and there is no window on the wall. It's incredibly claustrophobic. It's the realm of suffering. So yeah, everything's relative. Death can be horrible, but the birth can be worse, depending on your point of view.
Interesting. So yeah, that's something, I mean, also related to psychedelics, but also like, well, not really related, but I was thinking about dreaming and all these trainings in lucid dreaming that Buddhists do, like in tantric Buddhist tradition especially. And I mean, I, of course, probably it's impossible to answer, but I was kind of wondering if we can actually become conscious in our dreams. Can we actually become kind of meta conscious in our life, and maybe it is I mean, a combination of like psychedelics and this intellectual knowledge, and I mean, I don't know, but to make sense out of this experience somehow. But
I don't see any a priori reason why this shouldn't be possible, but I have never reached it. So I don't know whether this is encouraging or discouraging. I have never reached it. But I don't see any, in principle, reason why this shouldn't be possible to others. Maybe it is possible to others. The enlightened beings, maybe they exist. I am definitely not one of them. That much I can tell you.
Okay, Bernardo, I mean, it's fantastic. I could keep you talking for another hour easily, but and yeah, thank you for books, and it was really interesting to talk. I think I'll be also writing about some parts that we spoke about, because I mean, the way I try to conceptualize this whole idea of like art of dying is more as a journey, and I'm trying to combine the kind of loose imaginary bits, like parts of mythology, dreams, and like a real life experience, just to expand this narrative of kind of, you go like in a linear way through life, and to kind of open it up a little bit. So and I mean, it's kind of reassuring to me also, because I've been thinking about language, I've been thinking about dreams and all those things that you're also talking about. So hopefully it's the right path. Let's see what comes out.
Yeah, that's all we can do, is to do our best and see what comes out.
Okay, so thank you so much. If
You're welcome.
you wish, I can send you also a copy of this if the recording works well, and I'll keep you posted if the exhibition happens in real kind of space or whatever. Maybe it's online. I'll just keep you.
That would be nice. Then I could see it.
Yes.
I'll send you the audio recording from my side. In case you didn't record good audio, at least you would have clean one from my side.
That would be fantastic. Okay.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. You're welcome. Have a good evening.
You too. Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.